This video has been produced by Bobby Isaacs for the University of Southern Maine MBA program. It will define the calculation and offsetting of the carbon emission entailed in the trip to Vietnam taken in May 2014. Many websites are available for calculating the carbon footprint of various events. From the enormous number of CO2 calculators available on the internet, here are the ones I chose to evaluate for this project. 5 specific websites stood out as having good information and detail in their emission calculations for the actual trip to Vietnam. In addition to these, there were several other useful websites that, although not having good travel calculators, had great information on reducing personal emissions and were very useful in determining the offsets. TerraPass and Choose Climate are 2 calculators that had lots of detail. ChooseClimate.org even required the input of latitude and longitude of the locations for the travel. But the calculation stood out as very high or low as compared to the other calculators. I found it interesting that just as our professor had alluded, the .com site was very low, while the .org site was very high in its calculation. MyClimate had a very good, easy-to-use website which allowed for specific input of travel information, and it ended up with a 6.8 ton CO2 emission value. As seen, the car travel emission is dwarfed by the air travel. CarbonFootprint.com had my favorite calculator. It also ended up calculating an emission value around 6 tons CO2, but also had the capability of calculating personal emissions from daily activities and had much more comprehensive information available. Cotap.org also calculated 6.34 tons for CO2 emissions, but did so with a very simplistic calculator. All I entered was 1 medium trip, Dallas to Boston, 1 long trip, Tokyo to Ho Chi Minh City, and 1 extended trip, Boston to Tokyo. Other resources I used in my research included an article identifying a plethora of carbon emission calculation sites. Over a dozen sites were mentioned. The article can be found at theguardian.com. Another article evaluating 4 specific carbon calculators gave some good information. The article was found at 3degreesinc.com, but 2 of the sites listed were unavailable. With this information gathered, I compared the footprint values. The calculations yielded a surprisingly stable average in the 14,000 pounds range for CO2 emissions. For purposes of this calculation exercise, the carbon footprint for the trip to Vietnam, which needs to be offset, will equal 14,005 pounds, 6.36 tons of CO2. Now, how to offset this value? In determining how to offset the 6.36 tons I will emit due to this trip, I first visited the Environmental Protection Agency website. Their calculator for personal usage proved very useful and informative on how much I could eliminate through various lifestyle changes, including raising or lowering my thermostat, and reducing the miles I drive weekly, for example. The Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, although not providing a good calculator, did give some good information on ways to reduce emissions, with some numbers. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, the Carbon Footprint website had a great emissions calculator which gave a wide range of possibilities for CO2 footprints. The Angel could achieve a 0-ton footprint. The Devil would use over 15 tons with his choices. Me, in answering honestly, used about 5.19 tons. Even as a perfect angel for a year, I would still need more help to offset 6.36 tons. I really like meat, and going to the movies and dinner with my new wife isn't something I plan on giving up. Fortunately for me, Carbon Footprint anticipated that I wouldn't easily give up my vices and provide a host of choices for carbon offsets. In inputting my 6.36 ton emission, I found that several choices exist which could serve my need. I personally like the Certified Emission Reduction option, which, for $105, would fund research into sustainability on developing countries, suitably appropriate for offsetting my Vietnam excursion. So why am I interested in learning about business in Vietnam? The company for which I work is global, with sites in Texas and Maine, sites in Scotland and Germany, and sites in Japan and China. With such diversity, pursuing an education in foreign business is almost common sense. This experience will directly impact my career. Vietnam is also a beautiful, exotic country. Exposing myself to the country's culture, developing cities, and seeing the beauty of its land will expand my personal view of the world. Learning the business practices and interacting with the business leaders within the country will be invaluable. Finally, experiencing this country in a group learning setting gives opportunity that could never be had as an individual.